Chapter 9 of Hammered Hearts by Tracy Eire. I'm just going to read you a little selection of this one. Chapter 9's title is Heavy Are the Orcs of Night, and I should warn you up front, I'm not a good reader at all. Okay. The breeches criers were handed the message from the Guild of Scribes around noon. They saw that their copies included red script on fata paper in a town where both were reserved for royal use. They traveled through the streets already ablaze with rumors of what had happened on the waterfront. Another assassination attempt, it was whispered, and the regent had been involved. This made citizens uneasy, and no small few, aware the regent owed much of its safe prosperity to the rule of the fates, fumed. These town criers sat up on their corners and took out their sheets. They saw that entire lines were read, and the first words on their copy, an tor and an interex, were known to every one of them. This message came from the king and the regent. Then the news hit. Ora could hear the crier who would shelter at Keshen's outside. And here's the copy from the crier's sheets. So here we go. On Tor and on Interex require all people of bridges to proceed to their homes at once. In an orderly manner, each must leave their situation, market, school, and all other places, and lock inside their homes. Go now. Travelers to town must be ushered into shelter without fear of cost. Just as every sailor must be situated on ship or shore, all innocents must lock in. Afterward, none are to emerge or admit strangers. River and road will be patrolled by town guards, outriders, and the dreaded Morgwin knights. All have permission to destroy. If your life be precious, stay inside, shelter. The king of the fates and his sections will hunt tonight. There will be no quarter. The dockyards became a state of confusion. At first, people couldn't seem to believe the news. A fire of conversations and suppositions erupted around the spaces. Was this about the dragons? The attempted assassination? Something new? But when the guard began to march toward the city and the knights rode into town, when the outriders blew into the grove beside Keshen's manor house, the downtown drained quickly. Even those who loved to see the fata sections appear and considered it all the height of fanfare. The citizens saw everyone so chillingly armed. Carriages, and I've got to flip the page here, and carts waited to take those workers who lived farther out, and they were wide-eyed at the amassment of troops in the downtown. For all the human vacillation, the evacuation was as orchestrated as the locks high in the mountains by the Blue Mirror Lake were, all planned to flow like water through the rivers by the regent himself. Hovel, hotel, and manor house, even the warehouses were full with people, some of whom had elected to stay there just to protect the place that assured them a livelihood. Schools were full, even the bathhouse was occupied. The field and streets inside the White City were full of traders who had traveled here in their bow-topped caravans. Everywhere was packed. Shortly before sundown, the troops had had their assignments, and the streets were eerily deserted wherever they marched. A distant ship's bell blew in the silence. Many ships and barges full of people had decided to leave the shore for the violence they suspected would come. Many clustered out on the green mirror, beyond the reach of the longest bow. The sound was a lonesome one. From the steps of Keshen's place, Ora raised a hand to greet, followed Mark and a trio of his personal crew. The other Skynan chief in town slowed to a jog and padded up to her across the cobbles. "Hail, chief." "Chief Mark, how is camp?" She glanced around her and felt on the edge of the unnatural silence. "Well, it's better than this ghost town." Fala gave a visible shudder. "This is frightful all on its own. It looks like a trap." "Well, good." Ora stepped up, clapped a fist to her heart, and bumped his shoulder with it as he did the same. "We try, but I mean, have you seen anything out of order on the way here, chief?" "Trouble has already started, that's what." Fallow's scarred face creased with a smile. "Close to 18 men have crossed the Silken to get out of town. Skynan met them. Anyone not fighting we let fly. We're digging a hole for everyone else." Stedda came across the cobbled courtyard between Keshen's manor and the warehouses and nodded. "Chiefs?" "Stedda." Chief Mark glanced over him in his lawned attire and scowled. "You should dress like a Skynan boy, as you are. It's confusing." "I get the same thing from the lawns." Stella said in respectful amusement. Chief Buckmaster, I thought you might like to know there have been skirmishes in the town already. She swung up a fighting knife. Do they need a hand? No, not from what I heard. Stella shook his head. They came after the town guard, but the town guard are Skynan trained, under Skynan chief now. It didn't last long. Ora laughed at this, proud of her newest forces. Not that she'd met with them. She just gave the orders and trained them and paid them, because that's what a master did. Or what she saw them doing. I'll see that they're rewarded. The Ons boys jogged out from around the warehouses and to the steps where they shed their thicker coats. All right? She asked. Hate summer. Eric threw his coat down in disgust. Need water. The Ons had gotten even bigger in captivity, Ora found. Bigger shoulders, bigger arms. Clothes were tight across the figures they cut. Or maybe they were growing up some. Everyone in her crew was in their 20s now. A woman from the staff, who stood with a large boiler of water, laid links up to the pair of them. Ora turned from them. You know about the attempt. Rumor has it the regent was right there, Chief Mark noted. It said you foiled it, Buckmaster. All of that is true. She watched Red shut doors at the front of the primary warehouse and wait for the sound to tell him the locks had turned. He saw his crew and jogged over. I don't know who the target was, and the king doesn't care. Yes, so I see, Mark agreed with her. What can you tell me about the attempt that was made here? This won't comfort you any, but I think it's the beginning of our troubles, and not even the greatest of them, she sighed. It would explain why we see so many big fates out of town lately, building and digging. Aura's eyes widened. Fates? Digging? He was surprised. You didn't know? Oh, I knew. But you've seen them. Aura marveled at the notion. Fates digging out there. You flipped the page. All right. Many, Mark told her. Large fates. They can put down a trench deep enough to conceal themselves and long enough to go around the camp in a couple of days. Gorgeous, sharp angles, very beautifully dug. They are polite neighbors. Yes, we are fortunate in our company. Ora felt a wistful pang as she said it, and had to lay a hand over her chain mail heart. She settled down. But I didn't get such a good look at our assailant, and instead ran to secure the king. Be you, Red? You were there. I have been at that, Red said jovially. I know it sounds terrible, but it was quite rewarding to examine another of these thugs, though made a bit difficult by the very large numbers of arrows sticking out everywhere. However, that did nothing to hide the tattoos and Sekferik on him. He's another from Bellerhode for certain. I found the prison brand on this one. On the meat of him, right under the nest of his throat, the bell and the circle of swords. He was strong, Ora said uncomfortably. Eric brought up cups of water with a carry, and she took one with a nod. That's so. Red was gigantic, and seemed to find it hard to relate to the idea. His teeth were filed, by the way, so he'd given himself fangs. All the way across his mouth like a chaot? Ora asked. It was a curry who answered, no, just the canines. He took out a sketchbook from the pack he wore and stood to show her the drawing. Master Keshan brought me to get faithful drawings. Mark snorted. This young one could find work in a wheelbarrow, I swear to it. It was clear that he was proud of a curry. The mastery system of the Skynan rejoiced when people found and perfected their calling. Eric glanced across at his brother, unable to quite contain his smile. It was only peripherally that Ora saw this, though it pleased her. She was staring down at the drawings, as ever, amazed how quickly Akari's artistic skills had advanced in this town. The details were such that a dead man might have been dropped down directly in front of her, as horrid as that sounded. She snuck a glance at Akari's young and contented face. Then he returned her attention to his work. Their attacker had been tattooed with enough Sekferik to compose evil poetry, and the details showed in his filed teeth. Orc-like fangs. She shut the book and handed it back. Thank you, Akari. Yes, Chief. He tucked it away. How tall? She asked. Shorter than you, Akari told her. Older, too. Now Ora nodded at them all. I mean to say he was too strong, and I don't know why that would be. But I would like to know. He's been consigned to the flames for smelling up the nice room where Keshan likes to grow tubs of mushrooms and store his potatoes. Red chuckled. Oh, but while I was jotting notes about him, he had bloodletting scars and was underweight. The king made to search more deeply. He had a fake come and take the villain's blood right out of his foul arm. It was horrifyingly interesting. Eric laughed out loud at this before he could clap a hand over his mouth to prevent himself, even as Ora, also grinning, nudged him to make sure he'd heard it. Mark sighed at the ground and glanced at Stetta's children, but Stetta was already clapping Red's arm. It was nice. The Skynan chief turned his head away to laugh. The staccato clop of hooves brought them all to weapons and around to warrior stance. As they watched, a man with naked blade in hand ran out from between buildings and headed for the field. Behind him, Van's big black warhorse, Bane, came galloping. Van himself gave chase with short war spear. An elite dropped from the wooden awning of the warehouse and bounded to Bane's back. She fired off an arrow that felled the running man on the stones before she touched down on the cobbled yard. She turned, bowed to the door, and then jogged around the side of the warehouse, taking the closed gate in an effortless leap. Ora found that the king leaned in the doorway behind her, in shadow. Such quiet, he said, once discovered, and his exhalation alone demonstrated appreciation. Then he pivoted and headed down the great hall without a backward glance. Be ready. It will be but moments, said the Fata, who hadn't been there, but who was straightened up from landing, almost noiselessly. I'm going to turn the page here. Behind her. This was someone whose dark features, flat voice, and pale eyes she knew at once. Ora blinked. Hammerkas. He made a smooth pivot to walk up the great room and over to where the regent spoke with Arwan. Ora exhaled and straightened. Put away her swords, all right? We'll be setting off in a few minutes. Would anyone like to do some stretching? Red joked. The little crews and their chiefs by the door laughed at that. But the dark fate hadn't been wrong. The shadows grew long, and the king reappeared in an outfit that made him look all but identical to the variegated green of the elites. No cloak, no ornamentation. He wore a longbow, quiver, and blades for throwing, to complement the fighting knives and the magnificent sword, Glace. His hair was outlong, drawn back at the forehead and temple, into a pair of braids that met behind his head and terminated on his back, all of it bone pale and straight as a whip. Without the long coat and layers, decorative crowns, and all the attractively fashioned hair to soften him, it was overt that he was huge, powerful, and deadly as glacial ice. He seemed more stranger to her at the moment, with the angled absences of his expression, than he had in a very long time. Full darkness falls soon. Our time. He pulled up the hood of his jerkin. There was a gathering of fates around him. At a sign she couldn't detect, they flowed out the door, dozens of fates dressed, armed, hooded, and fleet. At once he was secret among them. Ora hurried after, no longer able to pick him out in the section. It took her 3.5 hours to reach him again after that.